I think it's about time that we talked about what an abject failure the Iowa Democratic Caucus was. This is probably one of the biggest blunders in modern election history, and of course it would happen for the 2020 Democratic primary. So, at the point of recording this video, only 71% of the votes have been counted. It's been well over 24 hours since the end of the caucus, and we still don't know all of the numbers. And for some reason, people on Twitter, prominent news reporters like Ed O'Keefe from CBS seem to blame Sanders for this problem. That's just stupid. So first off, let me start by explaining how a caucus works, okay? So take the state of Iowa, for example, and within Iowa there are different counties, all across Iowa, voting counties. And in each county there are several precincts, places where people go to vote. Now, in a caucus, you don't really technically cast a ballot for a candidate. At a caucus, you show up at the precinct, and at the precinct there are specific areas cordoned off for each candidate. So, for example, if I were to caucus in Iowa, I would support Bernie Sanders. And so I would go to the precinct that is designated to me, and I would go stand in the area cordoned off for Bernie Sanders, and that would technically count as one vote for Bernie Sanders. So, as more people go to different camps of different candidates, they get another person that counts as a vote. People don't really like caucuses unless you're actually a caucus state because it's time consuming. It takes a few hours as opposed to just showing up and voting. But there's a lot of energy, and people who are in caucus states enjoy this. There's a lot of spirit, and people like to actually physically show up and support their candidate. It's kind of like a pep rally, the way I see it. So at a caucus, you need at least 15% of the votes at the caucus in order to be considered viable. So what that means is you need 15% of the people who have showed up at the precinct in order to receive any delegates. If your candidate doesn't receive any delegates, if they don't receive 15% of the people who have showed up, then they're not viable. Now, at a caucus, it's kind of like they have ranked choice voting in a way, but in person. They have what they call realignments. So, say for example, if I were to support Andrew Yang and there were 100 caucus goers in total, and Andrew Yang only got 14 people to show up for him, then he didn't meet that 15% threshold, and Andrew Yang would be considered not viable. So there's a few different rounds of this. So if Andrew Yang is not viable and I'm caucusing for Yang, then there's a realignment and I can go caucus for another person. So say 25 people are caucusing for Bernie. At the realignment, I could leave Andrew Yang's camp and I could go support Bernie Sanders. Now, you don't have to realign. You could just stay at the Andrew Yang camp, and if people don't cross over to Andrew Yang, then he won't be considered viable and he won't receive any delegates. So there are pros and cons to realigning. But some people might not feel that it's within them to caucus for another person, and they strongly support their candidate, which is understandable. That's a decision that each person has to make, but essentially that's how it works. So, fast forward to today, over 24 hours past the closing of the caucus, and 71% of the votes have been counted. People seem to be blaming Bernie Sanders for this for some reason, and I'm not entirely sure why. Now, in 2016, there was a push for transparency in these alignments. In 2016, they pretty much did head counts of the people caucusing for their candidate, and there was no real paper trail for who was supporting who, which sounds pretty important to have considering this is deciding the fate of, the person who might take on whoever the Republican is. In 2020, there are measures in place, a paper trail, to track who votes for who, for what alignments, and what percentage of the vote that that person has at each alignment, which makes sense to me. To Ed O'Keefe at CBS, this doesn't make sense, and Sanders is to blame for this. So let's play the clip and kind of discuss this.
What's happening tonight, Elaine, is exactly what Bernie Sanders asked for, or whenever the results are released, in that we're going to have several data sets to work with tonight, or whenever the results come. First round, how much support each candidate got. The second round, raw total results, and then the delegate count. That's 3 data sets. The only one that matters is the delegate count, ultimately, whenever we get it. But the Sanders campaign and others were expected to seize on those first round numbers to show potentially either growth into that second round or how they may have helped influence the final results. And there was concern among other campaigns that the Sanders campaign especially would sort of exploit those early numbers that don't matter towards the final count to try to demonstrate that either his support had increased or things went his way in those earlier rounds leading into the second round. But yes, this is exactly the kind of situation the Sanders campaign was pushing for. More transparency, insurance that there was no fiddling with the numbers, as there were accusations 4 years ago that there might be. And so we will see now in the next few hours or days as this continues to play out, how exactly this gets sorted out. But the reaction tonight, that quick reaction from the Biden campaign especially, I suspect is designed to, actually it's pretty clear it's designed to cast doubt on the results here and try to reduce the importance and significance of what was going on here in Iowa ahead of primaries in states where Biden is poised to perform far better.
So all of the chaos, all of the confusion, and the reason that the votes haven't been released is exactly what Bernie Sanders asked for, according to Ed O'Keefe. I think for that statement alone, let's be nice, that statement is very stupid. Ed O'Keefe himself, I don't know much about him, so I won't say anything about him, but that statement is stupid. Me personally, as someone who votes, I like having transparency. I like seeing where the votes are going, and I think most people would agree with that. I think if you ask most people, that's a popular idea. The real reason that only 71% of the votes have been released to this point is because the DNC contracted some company called Shadow Company. What an ironic name for a process that you hope is transparent. And this company was supposed to count the votes and release the votes. Now, there are people saying that this company, who is, they either donated to Pete Buttigieg or they received donations from Pete Buttigieg. And, you know, a lot of the people involved in this organization, like CEOs, COOs, were former Hillary for America campaigners. I'm not going to say one way or another whether or not this whole situation is rigged because of the ties that the Buttigieg campaign has to this company, or the ties that the people working for this company has to Hillary Clinton. But I will say that it is entirely their fault that the entire vote totals haven't been released yet. There's no ways around that. You can't blame specific candidates for being involved in this debacle when they have nothing to do with it at all except for being a candidate at a caucus. This was an abject failure of the DNC, the Democratic establishment, and the Iowa Democratic Party. You know, just seeing this whole thing happen, 71% of the votes over 24 hours later is, you know, it's not helping their case. It's not, you know, relieving people of these fears that the Democratic establishment is just going to suppress their votes. Now, at the time of recording this video, I'll put the current numbers up on the screen about the percentage of votes that each candidate has at the time of this recording. So at the time of this recording, we have Pete Buttigieg with 31,353 voters, Bernie Sanders with 32,673 voters, Elizabeth Warren with 25,692 voters, and Joe Biden with 16,447 voters. Now, if you look at this graph, you'll notice this tally that says SDE, and it looks like that Pete Buttigieg has 26.8% compared to Bernie's 25.2%, even though Bernie Sanders has more votes than Pete Buttigieg does. Now, essentially what's going on here is rural votes are weighed heavier than non-rural votes. Now, this sounds a bit familiar. This sounds a little familiar, and I can't put my hand on it. I can't put my finger on it, rather. I'm not sure where I heard this before. I heard this a few years ago, where there was a candidate that got more votes than another candidate, but somehow the other candidate got more delegates than they did. I can't put my finger on it. But what I will say is that whether it's at the state level, whether it's at the country level, whoever has more votes should be the winner. They should be declared the winner. Now, if you look at that graph, Pete Buttigieg has more SDE than Bernie Sanders does, but the actual delegate allocation is 10 and 10 for each person. So whether you're, be careful of which graphs you're looking at, because a lot of the graphs currently are listing Pete Buttigieg as having, the most, as being number one, even though he has less total voters and the same amount of delegates that Bernie Sanders does. I think, this, in my perspective, this whole thing, I don't want to go as far as to say it's rigged, but Pete Buttigieg is living in the limelight, the media limelight, of being number one. He's going on, just giving speeches about how he defeat the odds, giving speeches about how he's victorious and he's going into New Hampshire victorious. But, the fact of the matter is, as it stands right now, Bernie Sanders has more votes than Pete Buttigieg does. And if the remaining 29% of the votes come out and it says that Pete Buttigieg has more voters than Bernie Sanders does, I would say the same exact thing. I would say that whoever has more voters should be the winner of the caucus. That's just how it should work. All in all, I think this is giving people less faith in the process. And we'll see. Hopefully we'll get the remaining 29% before June.